Very good. So let's come up with a detective control. Let's come up with a detective control that would detect if the sales associate recorded the wrong item on the sales order. What control could detect if someone made that specific mistake? If after the sales order was inputted, the company or the sales or an employee sent a confirmation email to the customer and asked them specifically, was this the item that you ordered? Let's debate about this. Would that be, if it worked, would it detect if that issue happened? Well, wouldn't it all depend on whether or not the customer responded? Customer is not an employee, so you can't necessarily make them respond to your emails. Even though it would be in their best interest to actually say something, you can't, like when you're designing AKA good controls for your company, you don't want it all to depend on whether or not somebody got your email. So how could the company itself detect if that happened? So if we went to the inventory records and we got the item, the name, would it detect if the wrong item was recorded on the sales order? So after the sale order has been inputted in the system, another employee could go back, listen to the phone call, and compare that item that was ordered to the item that is recorded on the sales order. If that happens, would that tell you if somebody recorded the wrong item? Yeah, it would. After the sales order has been inputted into the system, the sales associate looks at the sales order and then asks the customer, is this what you ordered? Yeah, as long as it's occurring after it was authorized in the system. If it happened before, it's a preventative control. See, this is why it's really important that you say the word after or before. Because if I'm asking you for preventative control and you just said they check it, it's going to be wrong because I don't know that you know what a preventative control is or a detective control is. One happens before an event, the other one happens after. Because by definition, one should prevent or stop a misstatement. The other one should tell me whether or not a misstatement happened. So before the misstatement happens, you have to determine, well, it has to happen first, right? So to detect if someone stole something, they had to have stolen it first. So after they've stolen it, then you check the security cameras and all this stuff, right? So detective controls, remember, always involve some sort of review. Preventative controls are going to involve some sort of stop measure to prevent something from happening. So if the sales associate, if the detective control is that after items have been ordered, an employee reviews the tapes of the phone calls and compares what was ordered on the phone call to what was written on the sales order, how would the auditor test that? They would observe the employee listening to the phone call and comparing the item ordered on the phone call with the item recorded on the sales order. Yes. Again, this test is all about whether or not you can recognize what a control is. So when you write your test of controls, you do have to write what the auditor is testing. You can't say the auditor then test that control. Because the question is asking what's the procedure that the auditor, like the question can say, how does the auditor test that control? Well, you can't say they test that control. You have to actually list it out, the procedure that they do to test it. After the sales order is input in the system, right? An employee compares what was recorded on the phone call to what was recorded on the sales order. That would be a detective control. This is just an example. right? You guys can come up with your own. But in this case, because we're talking about a specific risk, this was the risk that we were addressing. If you wrote a different risk, right, then your control would just have to be specific to whatever risk you, right? If this is a complicated one, don't write that one. It's an open note test. Don't pick this one. Okay, right? But the one that we used in class was that after, so again, after some event, after the sales order is inputted or authorized in the system, a sales associate compares the item recorded from the phone call, or item ordered from the phone call, to the item recorded on the sales order. Then you ask yourself, if an employee did that, would that detect if the wrong item was ordered? Yes. So you know you've written a very good control. As auditors, we think through this process because before we go through the client, we want to have some sort of expectation of what can mitigate a risk and what they should have done. That's another thing. If this is confusing to you, somewhere in your notes, make a page where it just kind of gives you the basics of who's doing what. If you're asked to give a control, who's doing control? Who actually does them? Management, employees, company personnel. If you're asked to give a test of control or a substantive test, who does that? The auditor. So you always want to phrase it as the auditor does these things. Because if an employee does it, it's not a test of control, it's a control. Right? Because auditors don't perform controls, they test them. They don't work inside the company. If they were doing the controls, then that would be a huge conflict of interest. But that is something that can sometimes confuse people on the exam too. You don't want to get a question wrong just because you said an employee does something instead of an auditor. That one word, it actually matters because if the employee is doing it, it's not the test control. But fortunately for you guys, you can use your notes, which the way I would study for this exam, honestly, is just like I did the last one. I would go through the slides with a whole new notebook and try to answer it, right? And if I couldn't come up with examples, then I would go back to my notes and rewrite the example so that it's clean and easy to get to. Because you know what's going to be on the exam. So why not in advance just write down all the examples for each cycle? Like you're going to get one of them, you know you're going to get a preventative or detective control, just write it out before you even get there. That way, when you get to it, you just flip it open and there you go. And then if you want to know if it's right, well, whenever we ask for examples in class, just use yours. You're like, hey, is this right? And guaranteed you got an A there. I'm just saying, that's what I would do. Okay, but before we leave this again, one of the reasons why we're taking more than 1 week to go through this first cycle is because it is different. I told you guys it was going to be different. It is different. Everything that we've learned before, we're actually applying it. You knew what the definition of controls were. You knew what a definition of all these other things are, but coming up with it one, now it's a whole different, which is why we're going to do so much practice. But what's important that you understand is what happens in the sales ordering process. Shipping does not happen in the sales ordering process. So avoid using that word because you don't even want to mistake it on the exam. Credit approval, even though technically in the real world it might be a part of this process, we think of it differently so we can talk about the controls. Invoicing, same thing, right? The only reason we're breaking it out like this is so that you guys can learn it. In the real world, just jumble it all back together. But what happens here? The sales associate records whatever the customer orders on the sales order. So you always want to mention the sales order in your control, in your risk, and in your test of control. You're basically using the same words, you're just changing them around, right? If the risk was the sales associate records the wrong item on the sales order, the control would be to prevent that is before recording the sales order in the system, the sales associate checks or confirms with the client or asks the client, is this the item that you ordered, before they enter it in the system. If they do it after, it's a detective control, still using the same word. What does the auditor do to test either one of those controls? Well, they can observe the sales, or so you know what I mean? You just use the same word. That's how you make sure that it's very specific. It's one of those things where in the real world, it happens a lot faster. We're just breaking it down slowly so that you can understand.